Harold Jenkins stood at the threshold of the luxury car dealership, feeling the sting of humiliation settle in his chest. His appearance, so carefully curated, felt suddenly inadequate in the face of the whispered laughter that followed him through the glass doors. The bright lights and sleek lines of the showroom didn't feel welcoming, they felt cold. Cold not because of the air conditioning, but because the atmosphere itself seemed to freeze when he entered. Conversations faltered, and eyes, sharp, calculating, swept over him, appraising, dismissing. He was a man out of place. His cardigan, frayed at the sleeve, and his trousers, a bit too worn to be fashionable, marked him as an outsider in a world of polished surfaces and glittering wealth. Harold could feel the eyes on him, felt the chuckles that followed, muted but unmistakable. They weren't subtle, and neither was the judgment. "Good morning," he greeted the nearest salesperson, a sharply dressed man whose name tag read Kevin. Kevin didn't even try to mask the smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Morning, sir. How can we help you today?" The tone was condescending, the words dripping with skepticism. Harold met Kevin's gaze without flinching. "I'd like to take a closer look at the 2024 Genesis G90, he said, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of doubt swirling around him. He pointed toward the sleek black sedan displayed under the showroom lights. Kevin raised an eyebrow, his voice laced with incredulity. "That's quite the car," he said, his words carrying a weight of doubt. "Are you sure you're looking for something like that?" The question stung, but Harold didn't allow it to show. He simply nodded. "I'm sure." Another salesman, unable to resist the opportunity for mockery, joined Kevin. "Maybe he's just window shopping," the second man quipped with a grin. "Happens all the time." The comment hit like a sharp jab, but Harold stood taller, his posture unyielding. The laughter around him rose, louder, more distinct. But Harold's calm remained undisturbed. When he asked about the price, Kevin dragged out the numbers as if speaking to a child. "That one starts at $80,000, he said, his voice slow and exaggerated, as though Harold might not understand the significance of such a sum. Harold nodded, taking mental notes, his fingers grazing the smooth surface of the car. Another voice, distant and condescending, muttered, "Maybe next time, sir." The laughter echoed, a bitter reminder of how easily they dismissed him, how easily they saw only what they wanted to see. Exiting the dealership, Harold paused outside, his gaze lingering on the building. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet resolve, a steel-like determination that simmered beneath the surface. He adjusted the brim of his fedora, a small gesture that spoke volumes of the man he was, a man who knew his worth, even if no one else could see it. Climbing back into his modest car, he drove away, but the laughter followed him. It wasn't behind him, it was ahead of him, propelling him forward with a new, sharp purpose. The decision he was about to make would change everything. Harold Jenkins wasn't just a 65-year-old man in a cardigan. His story was one of quiet endurance and relentless determination. Born and raised in Selma, Alabama, he had witnessed some of the most turbulent years of the civil rights movement. His parents, both factory workers, had instilled in him the value of hard work and dignity, even in the face of prejudice. For over 3 decades, Harold had dedicated his life to education, teaching history in public schools. But Harold wasn't the type of teacher who simply recited dates and battles, he made history come alive, weaving lessons of resilience and respect into every class. His students adored him, but teaching in underfunded schools meant Harold never made much money. Despite this, Harold was a man of foresight. While others splurged on fleeting comforts, Harold quietly invested small portions of his paycheck into stocks, bonds, and real estate. Over the years, those small investments had grown into a solid portfolio. After retiring, Harold found joy in volunteering at local libraries and mentoring young men in his community. But beneath that satisfaction lay a long-held dream, one he had kept close to his chest. A dream that, until recently, had seemed unattainable. He wanted to own something that symbolized success, something tangible, something he could call his own, a reward for a lifetime of discipline. That dream had become clearer when he first saw the luxury sedan in a car magazine months ago. He didn't need the car to prove anything to anyone. It wasn't about vanity. For Harold, the car represented a milestone, a way to honor his journey, a way to defy the expectations of a world that had often underestimated him. It wasn't about the car, it was about what it stood for, triumph over a lifetime of challenges. But Harold had also learned the sting of judgment. The scene at the dealership that morning was a stark reminder of how quickly people dismissed someone who didn't fit their narrow view of success. It was an unspoken rule, you had to look a certain way to belong. But Harold didn't dwell on the humiliation. Instead, he saw an opportunity to make a statement that went far beyond just buying a car. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, sipping chamomile tea and flipping through his financial records, Harold saw the path forward. The dealership wasn't just selling cars, it was part of a regional chain whose owner had been looking to retire. Harold had seen the listing months ago, but had dismissed it as a fleeting thought. Now, it seemed like fate. With quiet resolve, Harold picked up the phone and called his financial advisor. The wheels of change had begun to turn. Harold wasn't just buying a car. He wasn't even just buying a dealership. He was buying the chance to rewrite the way people saw him, and the way people like him would be seen in the future. The next morning, the dealership buzzed with its usual activity. Salesmen lingered near the coffee machine, swapping stories about the eccentric customers they'd encountered. Kevin, the salesman who had spoken to Harold, was in the middle of recounting yesterday's encounter, savoring every mocking detail. "I mean, did you see the guy?" Kevin chuckled, stirring sugar into his coffee. He was ready to take out a loan just to sit in that car. He paused, almost pitying Harold. "I almost felt bad for him, almost." Another salesman joined in. "You're nicer than me. I would have just told him to check the used car lot down the road." Their laughter was loud, unrestrained, a cruel symphony of mockery. To them, Harold had been nothing more than a joke. A man who didn't belong in their pristine showroom. A man who had no place in their world of tailored suits and polished shoes. Meanwhile, Harold was finalizing the paperwork with his attorney. The deal had been sealed quicker than he had expected. The dealership's owner, a man in his early 70s, had been eager to sell. By lunchtime, Harold Jenkins had officially become the new owner of the very dealership where, less than 24 hours ago, he had been the subject of ridicule. The irony hung heavy in the air, and Harold couldn't help but let it sink in. He thought about Kevin, about the others who had laughed at his expense. He wasn't a man who held grudges, but something about this moment, something about the way they had dismissed him, felt different. It wasn't about revenge, it was about teaching a lesson. A lesson they wouldn't forget. That afternoon, Harold returned to the dealership. But this time, he didn't walk through the front doors like a regular customer. No, he bypassed the showroom entirely and made his way straight to the manager's office. Inside, the general manager, Brian, greeted him with the same air of superiority that had marked Kevin's tone the day before. "Mr. Jenkins," Brian said, not even attempting to hide the condescension in his voice, "are you here for another look at the G90? Harold didn't let his composure falter. He smiled, calm as ever, though a quiet storm brewed behind his eyes. "Not exactly," he replied. "I believe you'll want to gather the staff for a meeting. I have some news to share." Brian frowned, clearly confused, but obedient. Within minutes, the sales team was gathered in the showroom, their laughter silenced, replaced by low whispers as they saw Harold standing at the front. Kevin leaned over to one of his colleagues, his voice a soft murmur. "What's he doing here?" Harold waited for the room to fall quiet, watching as each face turned toward him. When his eyes landed on Kevin, the smirk that had once stretched across the salesman's face had vanished, replaced by something unreadable. Harold spoke, his voice steady, his words deliberate. "Good afternoon. My name is Harold Jenkins. As of today, I'm the new owner of this dealership." The effect was immediate. Gasps echoed through the showroom. Kevin's face turned a shade of red that could have rivaled the deepest blush of embarrassment. Harold allowed the silence to linger, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. You could almost hear the collective breath they all held. But Harold wasn't finished. He had more to say, words that would make them rethink everything they had assumed. The silence was deafening, but Harold let it hang in the air, unbroken. He could see the stunned expressions of the sales team, each one grappling with the enormity of what he had just said. Brian, the general manager, was the first to recover, his voice a stammered mess of disbelief. "Wait, what? You bought the dealership?" "That's correct," Harold said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I finalized the deal this morning. I'm not here to gloat or embarrass anyone," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the room, "but we need to have a conversation about how we treat people who walk through those doors." Kevin, still visibly shaken, glanced nervously around the room, looking for a way out, but there was no escape. The rest of the sales team avoided Harold's gaze, their earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable sense of discomfort. Harold stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. Yesterday, I came in here as a potential customer. Someone genuinely interested in purchasing a vehicle. What I encountered wasn't professionalism. It wasn't respect. His words grew heavier, more deliberate. It was mockery. Assumptions were made about me, not based on what I said or did, but on how I looked. The room remained deathly silent, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Harold's words sank deep into their collective consciousness. His tone softened just slightly, but his resolve never wavered. I've lived a long life. I've seen a lot. And let me tell you this kind of behavior doesn't just harm your business. It reflects poorly on who you are as individuals. Brian, still flustered, tried to interject. Mr. Jenkins, I assure you this isn't how we typically operate. Yesterday was an anomaly. Harold raised his hand, cutting him off. I'm not here to argue or hear excuses. What I want is change. He paused, letting his words carry weight. Effective immediately, this dealership will have new standards. Standards that reflect integrity, respect, and professionalism. Everyone, regardless of their appearance, deserves to be treated with dignity when they walk through those doors. Kevin, his voice trembling, mumbled, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke. Harold's gaze locked on Kevin. There was no warmth, no forgiveness in his eyes. Only clarity. What's a joke to you can cut deeply for someone else. I hope you'll think about that moving forward. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, before Harold continued. I'm not here to clean house, he said. I believe people can learn and grow. But let me be clear, if this behavior continues, there will be consequences. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. But Harold wasn't angry. His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had spent decades teaching young minds. Someone who understood that real change came through guidance, not punishment. After a brief pause, Harold added, tomorrow, we'll have a proper meeting to discuss my expectations and the vision for this dealership moving forward. Until then, I'd like you all to think about the kind of environment we want to create here. Not just for our customers, but for each other. With that, Harold turned and left the room, leaving more than just instructions behind. He left them with a mirror, one that would force them to reflect on their actions. As Harold walked out of the meeting, the air felt thick with the tension he had left behind. Back in the manager's office, Brian sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Kevin, slumped in his chair, refused to meet the eyes of his colleagues. The sales team was no longer just embarrassed. They were shaken to the core. None of them had seen this coming. It was a humbling realization. That evening, Harold returned home to his quiet neighborhood. He sank into his favorite armchair, the familiar comfort of his surroundings a stark contrast to the day's events. He sipped his cup of tea, the warmth of it grounding him. Harold wasn't one to gloat over victories, but tonight, there was a special kind of satisfaction. It wasn't about the money or the title. He had lived comfortably before this, and he would continue to do so. This moment, however, carried a deeper meaning. It was about the principle of standing tall in the face of condescension and showing others that dignity could never be bought or sold. He wouldn't rule with fear. At precisely 9 a.m., the entire staff gathered in the conference room for the promised meeting. The air was thick with a mixture of curiosity and lingering tension from the previous day. Harold stood at the head of the table, a position that now felt rightfully his. He had never been one for dramatic gestures, yet today, the atmosphere was charged. What kind of leader would he be? Harold took a deep breath and surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his staff. I want to thank you all for being here, he began, his voice steady, drawing the attention of every person in the room. I know yesterday was a surprise, and I'm sure you have questions about what's next. He paused for a moment, letting his words settle, and then added, let me be clear. I'm not here to disrupt your lives. I know many of you have families to support, careers you've worked hard to build. My goal is to create an environment where everyone, staff and customers alike, feels valued. Kevin, still visibly uneasy, shifted in his seat, his nerves on display. Harold caught his glance and offered a slight, reassuring nod, silently telling him, you're part of this now. Harold continued, his tone calm yet resolute. Let's talk about where we're going. This dealership is more than just a business. It's a representation of this community. People don't just come here to buy cars, they come to experience good service, trust, and respect. That's what we will prioritize moving forward. He laid out his vision, training programs focused on customer service, diversity, and workplace culture. But it wasn't just about improving the workplace. Harold spoke passionately about community outreach, free car maintenance workshops for underprivileged families, and sponsoring local events. This wasn't about profit, it was about making the dealership a pillar of the community. The staff listened intently, their initial skepticism beginning to melt away. Harold's sincerity was undeniable, and it quickly became clear that his approach was about growth, not punishment. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. There was still some nervousness, of course, but also a flicker of hope. Harold wasn't a man who sought to tear people down. He wanted them to rise, together, as a team. As Harold left the room, the air seemed to shift with him. It wasn't just respect that filled the space. It was the quiet beginnings of something better. Over the next few weeks, the dealership began to change. The new standards Harold had implemented weren't just rules, they were a cultural shift. The transformation wasn't immediate. Some staff members struggled to adapt, and a few even left, unable to meet the new expectations. But for those who remained, Harold became a source of quiet inspiration. Kevin, in particular, found himself reflecting deeply on the events that had unfolded. The shame of his previous behavior gnawed at him, but Harold never singled him out. He never berated him or made him feel inferior. Instead, Harold treated Kevin like everyone else, firm but fair. One afternoon, Kevin hesitated outside Harold's office. He stood at the door, wringing his hands, visibly nervous. Finally, he knocked. "Come in, Kevin," Harold called from his desk, his voice calm and inviting. Kevin stepped inside, his posture tense. "Mr. Jenkins," he started, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how I acted when you first came in. It was wrong, and I've been thinking a lot about it." Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Apologies are a good start, Kevin," he said, his voice softening. "But real change comes from what you do moving forward. You've got potential, you just need to use it wisely." Kevin nodded, gratitude flooding his features. "Thank you. I'll do better." And he did. Over time, Kevin transformed. He became one of the most respected members of the team, known for his genuine care and professionalism with customers. It was a quiet redemption, but a powerful one, a direct reflection of Harold's belief in second chances. The dealership's reputation soared, not just for the quality of the cars but for its exceptional service. Customers who had once been intimidated by the sleek, high-end environment now felt welcomed. Harold saw to it personally, often greeting customers with a warm smile and setting the tone for the rest of the team. The community noticed. Word spread, and sales climbed steadily. But Harold's proudest moment came one Saturday morning, when a young man, wearing scuffed sneakers and a worn hoodie, hesitated near the entrance. His eyes darted across the rows of gleaming vehicles, unsure. He could feel the weight of judgment before anyone even spoke. But before anyone could make assumptions, Kevin stepped forward with a warm smile, his voice soft and welcoming. "Welcome," he said. "How can I help you today?" The young man visibly relaxed. The hesitation that had gripped him melted away. Harold watched from a distance, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. It was a small moment, but one that encapsulated everything Harold had worked for. As the dealership continued to thrive, Harold became more than just a retired teacher. He was now a respected leader, a mentor, and a living example of the power of perseverance and integrity. But for Harold, it was never about the recognition. He didn't seek applause or admiration. What mattered to him was what he had built, a legacy of respect, kindness, and a business that would stand the test of time. The laughter that had once echoed in the showroom now gave way to admiration, not because Harold had sought revenge, but because he had turned that moment into a teaching opportunity. The staff learned valuable lessons. Assumptions based on appearances could be deeply misleading and harmful. Customers learned they could find a place where dignity and respect were at the core of every interaction. And Harold? He proved that it was never too late to make a difference. So, what's the lesson here? It's simple: treat everyone you meet with respect. No matter who they are or where they come from. You never know the battles they've fought or the triumphs they've achieved. And more importantly, never let someone else's judgment dictate your worth. As Harold often said to his staff, a person's value isn't written on their clothes or in their wallet. It's written in how they carry themselves, and how they treat others. If this story resonated with you, remember to take its lesson to heart. And if you want to hear more stories like Harold's, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can remind the world of the values that truly matter.